The moment I saw him sitting in the third row, legs stretched out like he owned the room, I knew my life was about to collapse. Because I had slept with him once, and the little girl waiting for me at home had his eyes. For a fraction of a second, the lecture hall tilted. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone else could see, but just enough that my breath caught in my throat. My fingers tightened around the mahogany edge of the podium, my knuckles turning a ghostly white. It was the only thing keeping me upright. He hadn't noticed me yet. That, somehow, made it worse. The room was exactly what you'd expect from an Ivy League statistics class. Tiered seating, polished wood, students half buried behind glowing laptops and oversized iced coffees. There was a low humming murmur of entitlement and caffeine-fueled exhaustion. Sunlight streamed through the tall, arched windows, catching dust motes in the air like suspended stars. And there he was, third row. Center. At 6 feet 4 inches, he looked confined by the desk, a predator forced into a cage. His dark hair was swept back, as if by habit rather than effort, a few stray locks grazing a forehead that looked like it had never known a day of worry. His jaw was a sharp, dangerous line, softened only by a mouth that looked like it knew how to smile slowly, deliberately. And those eyes, piercing, electric blue. Too vivid to be real, too familiar to be coincidence. They were fixed lazily on the projector screen behind me, one muscular arm draped over the back of the empty seat next to him. My lungs felt like they were filled with concrete. It wasn't just the shock. It was the cellular memory of how those eyes had looked when they were inches from mine, clouded with a very different kind of intensity. He looked older than I remembered, or maybe I was the one who had changed. I looked down at myself, my professional attire, the doctor's degree on the wall, the invisible weight of motherhood on my shoulders. I was barely 5 feet 2 inches, a petite woman holding a heavy secret, standing before a giant who had no idea he was a father. I felt small, not just in stature, but in the face of the monumental lie I had been living. He wore confidence like a tailored jacket. Not loud, not sloppy. Just assured. As if the world had always bent slightly in his direction, and he'd learned to expect it. My stomach dropped, a cold, leaden weight settling in my gut. I had spent an entire year, 365 days, of which 3 months I spent with diapers, sleepless nights, and data modeling, convincing myself I would never see him again. I had built a fortress around my life, a sanctuary of logic and spreadsheets, and here he was, a human wrecking ball sitting in the middle of my 9 o'clock lecture. I cleared my throat, forcing my body into motion. Muscle memory took over. Years of teaching, years of pretending composure came easily to me, shielded me now. "Good morning," I said, my voice steady despite the frantic, erratic pounding in my ears. "I'm Dr. Cassidy Hale. Welcome to Advanced Statistical Modeling." A few students looked up, pens scratched. Someone yawned. He finally lifted his gaze. When his eyes met mine, recognition hit him like a slow, dawning sunrise. Oh God, it wasn't surprise that crossed his face first. It was something warmer. Something dangerously amused. His lips curved. Not fully, not yet, but enough that my pulse spiked. He didn't just remember me. He was savoring the memory. His expression was a silent, arrogant hello. One that spoke of rum, salt air, and the way I had arched my back under his touch. He remembered the salt on my skin. He remembered the way I breathed his name. I could see it in the way his pupils dilated, the way his head tilted just a fraction of an inch, acknowledging the absolute, delicious absurdity of our reunion. I turned away too quickly, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the remote for the presentation. I had tried to convince myself that I had been forgettable. A night blurred by music and sea air, and the desperate, hollow grief of a broken engagement. A woman passing through his life like a summer storm, loud, brief, and gone by morning. But the look in his eyes told me I had been wrong. Very wrong. 1 year earlier, Miami had felt like a good idea. That should have been my first warning. The city was all heat and neon and noise, the kind of place where people came to forget who they were, or to become someone else entirely. I told myself I needed the distraction. The sun, the anonymity. What I didn't admit was that I was running from the ghost of a life I'd spent nearly a decade building. 8 years is a long time to give someone. 8 years of building a life, of shared grocery lists, of quiet Sunday mornings where the future felt like a solid, unbreakable thing. I found out about the affair on a Tuesday. Tuesdays had always been unremarkable. Safe. I had come home early, my head full of plans for a dinner I'd never make. His phone had buzzed on the kitchen counter while he was in the shower. I wasn't a snooper. But the name on the screen, unfamiliar, accompanied by a heart emoji, had been a jagged glass shard to my chest. The betrayal wasn't just the message, it was the realization that my entire existence was a house of cards. When I left, I didn't take much. Just a suitcase, and the realization that at 30, I was starting over. I had always wanted children. I had waited. I had been responsible. I had built my career, checked all the boxes, trusted that the rest would follow. And then it hadn't. My biological clock wasn't just ticking, it was screaming in the silence of my empty apartment. So I made a decision. I didn't want a clinic. I didn't want a catalog of donors. I wanted one night. One memory. One moment of pure, unadulterated life that belonged only to me. I wanted to feel something other than the numb, hollow ache of being second choice. The club in Miami was loud enough that my bones vibrated. I wore a black silk slip dress that clung to every curve, the fabric whispering against my thighs. My blonde hair was loose, wilder than usual. I was a different Cassidy that night. I was a woman who didn't care about p-values or regression lines. I was a woman who wanted to be seen. And then he leaned against the bar beside me. "Let me guess," he had said, his voice a low, masculine rumble that cut through the bass. "Vodka soda. Extra lime." I glanced up, my head barely reaching the middle of his chest. He was a mountain of a man, his presence overwhelming. Up close he smelled like sandalwood, and the incoming tide. "You always eavesdrop on strangers' orders?" He smiled then, bright and unapologetic. "Only when I'm right." He was beautiful. Dark hair, broad shoulders beneath a crisp white shirt, and those eyes that seemed to see right through the mask I was wearing. They weren't just blue. They were the color of the deep Atlantic, turbulent and full of hidden depths. "What if you're wrong?" I asked, leaning in just enough to feel the heat radiating off him. "Then I owe you a drink," he said easily, his gaze dropping to my lips. "Which still feels like a win. For me, at least. Confidence is a dangerous thing, mister." "Just Eden," he'd said, his voice dropping an octave. "And danger is a matter of perspective, Cassie." His name was Eden. Just Eden. And I was just Cassie. No last name. No context. We danced, and the height difference should have been awkward, but it wasn't. He tucked me into the crook of his arm, my face pressed against his chest, the scent of expensive cologne and warm, clean skin intoxicating me. When he leaned in to speak near my ear, his hand brushing the small of my back, I felt a spark of electricity so sharp it made my toes curl. "You look like someone who's trying very hard not to be here," he whispered, his lips brushing the shell of my ear. "And you look like someone who enjoys pointing that out," I countered, breathless. I felt like a moth, flirting with a very beautiful, very hot flame. "I enjoy the truth," he murmured, his hands sliding lower, anchoring me to him. "And the truth is, you're the most interesting thing in this room." I followed him to his yacht. It was a masterpiece of steel and glass, bobbing in the marina. On the deck, under the silver moonlight, the air was thick with tension and the smell of the ocean. The city lights of Miami looked like fallen jewelry in the distance, but the only light that mattered was the one in his eyes. He didn't rush me. He moved with a predatory grace, closing the distance between us until I was forced to tilt my head back just to see him. When he finally kissed me, it wasn't a question. It was a claim. His hands were large, certain, tracing the line of my spine until I was pressed flush against him. He felt like heat and solid muscle, a force of nature I couldn't resist. That night, in the cabin of that boat, I wasn't a professor. I wasn't a jilted bride. I was just a woman being worshipped by a man who didn't know my name. He touched me like I was something precious, his fingers lingering on my skin, his breath hot against my neck as he explored every inch of me. The sensuality was overwhelming, the friction of skin on silk, the low moans lost in the sound of the waves, the sheer staggering power of him over me. It was the first time in my life I had let go of control, and it was terrifyingly perfect. I left before the sun came up, leaving nothing behind but the ghost of my scent and a heart that finally felt like it belonged to me again. "Dr. Hale?" The present snapped back into place with the force of a physical blow. A student in the front row was blinking at me, a pen poised over her notebook. "The equation on the board, is that a standard deviation or a variance?" "Variance," I said, my voice tight, my throat feeling like it was lined with sandpaper. "It's the variance, because we are measuring the spread of the data, not the square root." As I continued the lecture, I felt Eden's gaze. It wasn't just a look, it was a touch. It traveled over my face, down to my hands, back to my eyes. He was studying me like a complex problem he intended to solve, his pen tapping rhythmically against his chin. Every time I looked in his direction, he didn't look away. He leaned back, a faint, knowing smirk playing on his lips, as if we were sharing a private joke in front of 100 people. My lecture was a disaster. I stumbled over terms I could usually recite in my sleep. I skipped 3 slides. I felt like a fraud, a woman playing at being a professional, while the father of her child sat 10 feet away, looking like he wanted to devour her. When the bell finally rang, signaling the end of the hour, I moved with frantic energy. I needed to get to my office. I needed to lock the door. I needed to call the nanny. I needed to make sure Emma, my beautiful blue-eyed Emma, was safe. Cassie? The sound of my name, that name, in his voice sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through me. It was lower than I remembered, richer, vibrating with a familiarity that made my skin flush. I turned slowly, pulling my briefcase to my chest like a shield. He was standing at the base of the podium now. Up close, the height difference was staggering. I had to look up, my neck straining to meet those blue eyes. He was wearing a simple black shirt, the top buttons undone, revealing a hint of the collarbone I had once traced with my tongue. He looked entirely too good in this lighting. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. "It's Dr. Hale," he chuckled, a low vibration that I felt in my own chest. "You always were terrible at lying, Cassie. Even in Miami, your eyes go wide and your breathing hitches. Just like right now." "You should go," I whispered, looking around to see if any students were lingering. A few were staring, curious at the tension radiating between the tiny professor and the massive auditor. "This isn't appropriate." "You're a student? Audit," he said, his eyes dancing with mischief. He stepped into my personal space, his scent, that same sandalwood and sea, wrapping around me like a memory. "I'm interested in the subject matter. Or maybe just the teacher. I heard you were the best in the department. They forgot to mention you were the one who ran out on me." "Eden, stop. So you do remember my name," he said, stepping closer until I could feel the heat from his body. The air between us grew heavy, charged with the memory of that yacht. He leaned down, his face inches from mine, and for a second, I thought he might kiss me right there in the hall. "You disappeared. No note, no phone number. I spent 3 days looking for you in every hotel on the Strip. I thought I'd hallucinated you. I didn't owe you anything," I snapped, though my heart was betraying me, thudding against my ribs so hard it hurt. "It was one night. That was the agreement." "I don't remember agreeing to anything," he said softly, his voice dropping to a velvety caress. "Except that we were good together. Exceptionally good. And you left a lot of unanswered questions, Dr. Hale." "There are no questions," I said, my voice rising in a desperate attempt to regain control. "There is a syllabus, a grading scale, and a strictly professional relationship. That is it." He arched a dark eyebrow. "Professional? Is that what we're calling it? Because my memory of you in that black silk dress is anything but professional." Before I could respond, a slender blonde girl with a designer bag looped her arm through his. "Eden? You coming? We're going to be late for lunch." He didn't look at her immediately. His eyes stayed on mine, intense and searching, as if he were trying to see the secret I was guarding so fiercely. He looked through me, past the glasses and the blazer, to the woman who had cried out his name in the dark. "In a minute, London," he said, his voice distracted, never breaking eye contact with me. The girl, London, eyed me, a flash of territorial suspicion in her gaze. She was young, polished, and clearly used to getting his attention. She looked at my modest heels and my sensible bun, with something close to pity before walking toward the door, her heels clicking a sharp rhythm. Eden turned back to me, his smile turning wicked. It was the smile of a man who had found exactly what he didn't know he was looking for. "We should talk, Dr. Hale," he said, emphasizing the title with a hint of mockery that made my toes tingle. "Properly. Over dinner. I have a lot of data that needs modeling." "No," I said, my voice regaining some of its iron. "We absolutely should not. Stay away from me, Eden." "I mean it." He didn't look deterred. If anything, he looked challenged. He straightened to his full, imposing height, casting a long shadow over me that felt like a premonition. "You say that like it's going to stop me," he said, his voice a promise. "I'm very good at getting what I want, Cassie. And right now, I want to know why you look like you've seen a ghost." As he walked away, his stride long and effortless, I felt the walls of my carefully constructed life beginning to crack. The air in the room felt too thin. He didn't know about Emma. He didn't know that every time I looked at my daughter's face, I saw the man who just walked out that door. He didn't know he had a daughter who shared his stubborn chin and those piercing, electric blue eyes. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone with shaking fingers. There was a photo of Emma on the lock screen, her bright blue eyes crinkled in a laugh, her blonde curls a messy halo. I had to get her home. I had to hide. I had to figure out how to navigate a semester with a man who was a walking reminder of the most impulsive and most consequential night of my life. But as I looked back at the empty seat in the third row, I knew there was no hiding from a man like Eden. He had found me, and I had the terrifying feeling that he wouldn't stop until he found out exactly what I was hiding. The statistics were against me. One night, one man, one city, and now, one massive problem. I didn't sleep that night. Emma did, blissfully unaware, her small chest rising and falling beneath the soft glow of the nightlight shaped like a crescent moon. But I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the look in Eden's eyes when he'd said my name. Cassie. The way his mouth had curved like he already knew the ending to a story I was still desperately trying to rewrite. I had survived a year on willpower and careful choices. I had built a life that made sense. Early mornings, late lectures, daycare drop-offs, grant proposals, grocery lists pinned to the fridge. I had compartmentalized my life so efficiently that it had almost become a skill. I was a senior lecturer at an Ivy League institution. I dealt in hard data and verifiable facts. But the fact sitting in the third row of my lecture hall was one I couldn't calculate my way out of. Seeing him again cracked something open. Emma stirred, letting out a small sound that made my heart lurch. I got up, moved quietly to her crib, brushing my finger along her cheek. At nearly 4 months old, she was starting to lose that newborn puffiness, revealing the bone structure beneath. Even half asleep, she frowned at the intrusion, her lashes dark against her skin. Those eyes. I'd told myself for months that genetics were funny things. That resemblance didn't mean destiny. That biology didn't have to carry narrative weight. I had convinced myself that since I was the one who did the midnight feedings, the one who rocked her through the colic, the one who had literally built her from my own cells, she was mine. Now it felt like the universe had laughed in my face. Looking at her was like looking at a miniature, softened version of the man who had just upended my professional sanctuary. The next morning, I dressed with mechanical precision. Neutral blouse, tailored trousers, low heels I could walk fast in if I needed to. My hair pulled back into a style that said professional, rather than approachable. Glasses on, lips bare, armor. The routine was my anchor. 6 a.m., breast pump and coffee. 6:30 a.m., diaper change and tummy time, while I checked the overnight market fluctuations for my morning seminar. 7:15 a.m., packing the diaper bag with the precision of a tactical medic, extra onesies, wipes, the specific pacifier she liked. 8 a.m., the handoff to Mrs. Gable, the nanny who lived 3 doors down and smelled perpetually of lavender and oatmeal. "She's a bit fussy today, Mrs. Gable," I said, handing over the car seat. "I think she's teething early." "Don't you worry, Dr. Hale," the older woman cooed. "She's got your spirit. She'll be just fine." I hoped so, because my spirit was currently held together by caffeine and sheer terror. By the time I reached campus, I had convinced myself that yesterday had been an anomaly, that Eden would take the hint, that whatever curiosity or nostalgia he felt would burn itself out quickly. After all, he was a student here, well, an auditor, and I was faculty. The power dynamic alone should have been enough to keep him at bay. I was very good at lying to myself. I walked through the hallowed halls of the finance department, past the oil paintings of men who looked like they'd never changed a diaper in their lives. This was the Cole family's territory. I hadn't realized it until I saw the brass plaque on the new wing, the Cole Center for Economic Excellence. Eden wasn't just a student. He was a finance major with an audit minor, a lethal combination for a man born into one of the most powerful families in the country. His presence here wasn't just academic, it was an inheritance. He was being groomed to take over an empire, and this university was practically his backyard. "Dr. Hale." I had just reached my office door when his voice cut through the hallway. I froze. My keys felt heavy in my hand. Slowly, I turned. He stood a few feet away, hands tucked casually into the pockets of dark slacks, black button-down open at the collar. He looked infuriatingly at ease, as if ambushing former lovers-turned-lecturers was a perfectly normal part of his morning routine. The morning light caught the blue of his eyes, and for a second, I forgot how to breathe. "You can't keep doing this," I said flatly, my voice echoing slightly in the marble corridor. He smiled, a slow, predatory thing that made my stomach flip. "Good morning to you too. You forgot your coffee today? You usually have that oversized iced latte by 8:45. My blood ran cold. "You've been watching me? I've been noticing you," he corrected, stepping closer. "There's a difference. One is stalking. The other is appreciation of a very consistent routine." "Eden," I hissed, glancing around. A couple of students passed by, too engrossed in their phones to pay us much attention, but my pulse still spiked. "You should not be here. This is the faculty wing. I'm here to see my advisor," he said mildly, though the glint in his eyes said otherwise. "I attend classes here. Occasionally I walk between them." "It's a public-ish space, Cassie." "It's Dr. Hale," I snapped. "And you know what I mean. Your presence is disruptive." His smile softened, turning into something more intimate, more dangerous. "Disruptive? That's a strong word. I prefer to think of myself as a pleasant surprise." He tilted his head, studying me with a terrifying intensity. "You look tired, Cassie. Those dark circles aren't just from grading papers." "I have a life," I said sharply, gripping my briefcase. "A busy, fulfilling life that does not include you." "That's funny," he replied, his voice dropping to a low rumble that vibrated in my bones. "Because from where I'm standing, I seem to be very much included. You're shaking, for one, and you haven't looked me in the eye for more than 3 seconds." I opened my office door, stepped inside, and turned back to face him with what I hoped was finality. I wanted to slam the door, but that would be a scene. "You were a mistake," I said quietly, the lie burning my throat. "A moment, a one-night stand in a city built for them. That's all it was, Eden. A data point in a very long year." Something flickered behind his eyes. Not anger. Something sharper. Hurt? My mind supplied, immediately followed by a wave of guilt. I remembered the way he had held me on that yacht, the way he had listened to me talk about my broken engagement until the sun started to peek over the horizon. He hadn't just been a body, he had been a lifeline. He recovered quickly, that easy coal confidence snapping back into place. "You keep saying that like you're trying to convince yourself, but data points don't usually make people's hands shake a year later." "Leave," I said. He leaned closer, his hand resting on the doorframe, effectively trapping me in the doorway. "I'm not asking for anything inappropriate. I just want coffee. A conversation. Closure, maybe. I think I earned that much when I spent 3 days scouring Miami for a woman who didn't even leave a last name. There is no closure, Eden. Normal people don't get closure for a one-night stand. The whole premise of the affair is that it has clean endings," I said. "There's just distance. And I'd like to keep it that way." He held my gaze for a long moment, his eyes searching mine for the truth I was burying. Then he straightened, hands up in surrender. "Okay," he said. For now. For now." The words felt like a threat and a promise all at once. London made herself known 2 days later. I was having lunch alone at a small, overpriced cafe on the edge of campus, trying to catch up on peer reviews while picking at a kale salad. The air was crisp, the smell of wood smoke and expensive perfume lingering in the autumn air. She arrived like a force of nature, all polished confidence and subtle entitlement. Her blonde hair was styled in that "I just woke up like this" way that actually takes 2 hours and a professional stylist. At 5 feet 11 inches, she was a bombshell, a perfect match for the world Eden inhabited. She perched on the chair across from me without asking, crossing her long, tan legs with practiced ease. Wealth emanated from her in waves. The Hermes scarf tied to her bag, the diamond studs that were probably worth more than my car. "Hi," she said brightly. "I'm London." "I know," I said before I could stop myself. Her smile sharpened, her eyes scanning me with the clinical precision of a rival. "You do? You were in my class," I said smoothly, forcing myself to stay calm. "With Eden." "Oh." She laughed lightly, a melodic sound that felt entirely rehearsed. "Right. Statistics. I forget you're his professor. It's such a quaint subject, isn't it? All those numbers." I stiffened, my professional pride bristling. "It's the foundation of modern finance, London. I'm sure your father would agree." "Of course," she said, her eyes gleaming. "I just wanted to introduce myself. Eden talks about you. A lot." My coffee cup paused midway to my lips. My heart performed a jagged little dance. "He does? All the time," she replied. She leaned forward, the smell of her expensive floral perfume cloying. "Says you're brilliant. Intimidating. Kind of terrifying. He has a thing for intellectual challenges. He's always been like that, ever since we were kids at the country club." "That's flattering," I said, my voice cool. I could feel her marking her territory. She wasn't just a girlfriend, she was a fixture of his life. "You should know, he's like this with women he finds interesting," she continued, her voice dropping conspiratorially. "He's a collector of sorts. He likes to poke and prod until he figures out how things work. But he gets bored easily once the mystery is gone. I've known him practically all my life, and the one thing about Eden Cole is that he always returns to what's familiar." I met her gaze, refusing to be intimidated by a 22-year-old with a trust fund. "Is that so? Thank you for the warning and the background story, London. But I assure you, my only interest in Eden is his grasp of regression analysis." She stood, smoothing her silk skirt. "Just thought you should know what you're dealing with. He's a Cole. They don't just attend this school, they own it. It's best not to get caught in the machinery." As she left, I sat back, my heart racing. London wasn't just a classmate. She was a reminder of the world Emma belonged to, a world of legacy, power, and people who viewed life as a game of acquisition. Eden found me again the following week. This time, it was after class. in the quiet hum of an empty lecture hall. The sun was setting, casting long amber shadows across the tiered wooden desks. I was packing up my laptop, my mind already on the daycare pickup, and the fact that I was low on formula. He waited until the last student had filed out before approaching, his steps unhurried and rhythmic. "You're avoiding me, Cassie. That's the idea. Is it working?" He stopped at the edge of the podium, his presence filling the empty space. I sighed, rubbing my temples. "What do you want, Eden?" "I have 1,000 things to do." He considered that, his gaze softening. "Honesty. Just once, without the Dr. Hale mask." I laughed, a sharp and humorless sound. "You're about a year too late for that. The mask is part of the job. I want to know why you left without a word," he said, his voice dropping. "I woke up on that boat and you were just gone. Like a ghost. I thought I'd said something, done something." "You didn't," I said, looking down at my hands. "It was a beautiful night, but I wasn't in a place where I could stay." "Why not? Are you married? Is there someone else?" "No. It's not that." "Then what?" He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell him, clean, understated, devastatingly familiar. It was the scent of the only night I'd ever felt truly brave. "Because you were never meant to matter," I whispered. The words tasted bitter. I had gone out that night, looking for a solution. I had timed it perfectly with my ovulation, a clinical decision made in a moment of emotional chaos. I was never meant to see him again. I was supposed to have my baby, and my career, and my secret. But the truth was, I had spent the last year seeing his ghost in every blue-eyed child at the park, in every tall man in a dark shirt. He reached out, his fingers brushing the fabric of my sleeve. "You don't forget someone like you, Cassie, no matter how much you tell yourself it was nothing." "I've tried. Trust me, I've tried to find a reason to let it go." My heart thudded painfully against my ribs. "This has to stop. You are my student. You are a Cole. This is an Ivy League university, not a yacht in Miami." "Not for long," he replied, a slow smirk spreading across his face. "It's my final year. And I switched sections this morning. You're not even my primary instructor anymore." I stared at him, my mouth falling open. "You did what?" "Relax. No rules broken. I'm still auditing, but under Professor Miller." I checked the handbook. "No conflict of interest if we grab that coffee." "That doesn't change anything," I said, though my resolve was crumbling like dry earth. "It changes enough," he countered. "We can talk. That's all I'm asking." I thought of Emma, of the way she laughed when I tickled her feet, of the life I had built on a foundation of omission. "No," I said again, though it sounded weak even to my own ears. Eden studied me, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded once. "Okay. But I'm not done. I didn't get to where I am by taking no for an answer on the first try." The realization hit me gradually, like a bruise blooming beneath the skin. Eden wasn't just confident, he was strategic. He was a finance major who understood risk and reward. He started showing up in my peripheral vision, at the faculty coffee shop, in the library, at the departmental mixers. He was always polite, always professional, but his gaze never left me. I began noticing things I hadn't before. How his questions in other seminars were incisive and thoughtful. How other students deferred to him without realizing it. How faculty members greeted him with a familiarity that went beyond simple recognition. I did what I should have done weeks earlier. I sat in my darkened living room after Emma had finally fallen asleep and Googled him. Eden Cole. The results were staggering. The Coles didn't just have money. They had history. They had buildings named after them in 3 different states. His father sat on boards that shaped global markets. Eden himself was a former star athlete, a philanthropist, a man whose every move was documented in society columns. Emma's inheritance wasn't just genetic. It was a legacy of power. The thought terrified me. If they ever found out, if he ever found out, they could take her. They had the resources, the lawyers, the influence. I was just a professor with a solid middle-class income and a very big secret. That night, the doorbell rang at 8 p.m. I stared at the monitor through the peephole, my heart pounding in my throat. Eden. He looked restless, his dark hair messy as if he'd been running his hands through it. He looked human. I opened the door only a crack. "This is wildly inappropriate, Eden. You can't just come to my home." "I know," he said, his voice strained. "I'm sorry. I couldn't sit in that apartment anymore thinking about you. I needed to see you outside of that school. As a person." "You should leave," I said, even as I felt the magnetic pull of him. 5 minutes, Cassie. That's all. If you tell me to leave after 5 minutes, I'll never come back." Against my better judgment, Against every instinct of self-preservation, I let him in. He stood awkwardly in my living room. It was a far cry from a yacht. There were scattered laundry piles I had been folding, a pram tucked into the corner, and framed photos of my parents on the mantel. The air smelled of baby powder and vanilla candles. "You have a nice place," he said softly, his eyes roaming the room. "It feels real." "It's my life," I said, crossing my arms. The silence stretched, thick with the things we weren't saying. "You hurt me when you left without a word," he said finally, looking at me with a raw honesty that stripped away the coal armor. "Whether you meant to or not. I thought we had something." Guilt twisted in my chest. "I didn't plan on it. I panicked." "I know," he said, "but you don't get to decide what matters to other people. You keep pushing me away like I'm a pest, or like you're hiding something behind a wall of statistics. I don't understand. If you don't want to rekindle Miami, fine. But don't treat me like a stranger." I opened my mouth to respond, to give him some practiced excuse about professional boundaries, when a sound came from the nursery, a sharp, demanding cry. Emma was awake. My blood turned to ice. My entire world narrowed down to the sound of that baby, and the man standing in my living room. Eden's gaze snapped toward the hallway, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Is that?" He didn't wait for an answer. He moved toward the sound, his long strides covering the distance before I could move. I scrambled after him, but I was too late. He stood in the doorway of the nursery, the soft blue light of the humidifier casting a glow over him. I watched from behind as his shoulders stiffened. Emma was sitting up in her crib, rubbing her eyes, her little face scrunched in a pout, as Eden stopped crying. She looked up at the giant in the doorway, her eyes wide and curious. Electric blue eyes, a heavy, square jawline that matched his perfectly. In that moment, watching Eden's expression shift from shock to a staggering, gut-wrenching awe, I knew. The truth was done hiding. The data had been analyzed, and the result was undeniable. "Cassie," he whispered, his voice breaking as he looked from the baby to me. "She has my eyes." Neither of us would ever be the same. Neither of us moved. The nursery hummed softly around us. The rhythmic, mechanical sigh of the white noise machine, the faint gurgle of the humidifier, and the distant, muffled symphony of the city outside. Inside this room, the air felt heavy, saturated with a truth that had been invisible 5 minutes ago, and was now the only thing that mattered. Emma stared up at Eden with solemn, wide-eyed curiosity. She didn't cry. She didn't look away. She simply observed him with that unnerving infant intensity, her tiny fingers flexing against her Pima cotton blanket as if she were testing the physical reality of the giant standing over her. "She has my eyes." The words weren't loud. They weren't accusatory. They were devastated. They carried the weight of a man who had just realized he'd missed the first chapter of his own legacy. I stepped past him before he could say anything else. I needed to break the circuit, the electrical current humming between them. My movements were automatic, the practiced, fluid motion of a mother whose body had become a tool for another's survival. I lifted Emma from her crib, settling her small, warm weight against my shoulder. I buried my nose in the soft curve of her neck, inhaling the scent of milk and lavender detergent. It was the only thing that felt real. "She gets that a lot," I said. My voice was too high, too brittle. It was the voice of a woman trying to explain away a statistical impossibility. Eden didn't look away. He didn't even blink. Up close, the resemblance was no longer a theory. It was a physical law, not identical. Emma had my nose and the slight curl of my hair, but the architecture of her face was his. The high brow, the stubborn set of the jaw, and that sharp, startling blue in her gaze. It was a blue that didn't exist in my family, of muddy hazels and dull browns. It was the coal blue, the color of Ivy League endowments and Atlantic yachting trips. "How old is she?" he asked. His voice was thick, like he was speaking through water. "Almost 4 months, I replied, my back turned to him as I adjusted her onesie. I could practically hear the gears turning in his head. Eden was a finance major. He was a man of ledgers, interest rates, and precise timelines. I could see the rapid calculations happening behind his eyes, the subtraction of weeks, the counting of months. The mental map he drew led straight back to a humid night in Miami, to a cabin that smelled of salt air and expensive rum. The math snapped into place like a jagged puzzle piece. "She was conceived when?" he asked quietly. I hesitated. For a fraction of a second, the instinct to lie, to say it was a late-night mistake, with an X, a donor, a shadow, reared its head. But looking at him, seeing the way his hands were trembling as they hung at his sides, I didn't have the energy for the theater. "About a year ago," I said. He closed his eyes, just for a moment. He looked like a man bracing for a blow he'd already felt. When he opened them again, the cocky, untouchable cold confidence was gone. In its place was something far more raw, This wasn't the auditor looking for a thrill. This was a man realizing his life had been hijacked by a ghost. "You didn't tell me," he said. "It wasn't a question. I didn't plan to," I replied, turning to face him. Emma shifted against me, letting out a soft, contented sigh. She reached out a wandering hand and caught a stray lock of my hair, tugging it with surprising strength. Eden watched the movement with a reverence that made my chest ache. It was the look of a man watching a miracle he wasn't invited to. "Why?" he asked. There it was. Not the anger I expected. Not the legal threats or the "how dare you." Just a simple, soul-crushing why. I walked toward the rocking chair, putting the physical barrier of the crib between us. I needed distance to maintain my resolve. Because I didn't want this for her. I didn't want the complexity. I didn't want the Cole family shadow over her before she could even crawl. His brow furrowed, a flash of the old Eden returning. "This? You didn't want a father who wanted her? You didn't want a family that could provide everything?" "She was supposed to be mine," I said, my voice hardening. "I built a life for us. I calculated the risks. I planned for the nursery, the childcare, the education. I didn't plan on sharing her with anyone, especially not a 22-year-old student with a legacy I can't compete with." He stepped further into the room, his presence making the nursery feel impossibly small. "You decided that without me. You used me, Cassie. You used me like a damn sperm bank?" "Yes," I said. I didn't flinch. I let the word hang in the air, cold and callous. I went to that club with a purpose. I was 30, my life had just imploded, and I wanted something that was truly mine. You were perfect, you were beautiful, you were brilliant, and your genetics were impeccable. I didn't want a relationship, Eden. I wanted a child. The truth was a scalpel, and I used it to cut the connection before it could take root. I saw the flash of pain in his eyes, the realization that the night he'd spent 3 days searching for had been, for me, a business transaction. "She's my daughter," he said, his voice gaining a dangerous edge. "She's my life," I countered. For the first time since he'd entered the room, Eden looked at me, not as a professor, not as a conquest, but as the woman who had carried his child in secret. He looked at my tired eyes, the faint milk stain on my shoulder, the way I held Emma like she was the only thing keeping me on this planet. "You did this alone," he said slowly, the anger giving way to a terrible kind of awe. "You were pregnant while you were teaching. You gave birth. You've been raising her for 4 months. He shook his head, his voice softening. "By yourself." "I wasn't by myself," I said, though the lie felt thin. "I have Mrs. Gable. I have my colleagues. I have a plan for every contingency. I didn't need a Cole to swoop in and save us. I could have been there," he said gently, ignoring my bite. "I would have been there. I'm not my father, Cassie. I don't just write checks. I show up." I laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that made Emma jump. "You're a senior in college, Eden. You have a life of galas and finance internships and girls like London. You don't know the first thing about a 4-month-old's sleep regression, or what it's like to have your heart walking around outside your body. I know what it's like to want something and not know why," he said, stepping closer to the crib. "I spent a year wondering why I couldn't get you out of my head. Now I know. It wasn't just the sex. It was her." Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Emma began to fuss, her little face reddening as she reached the limit of her patience for adult drama. I bounced her slightly, my hips swaying in that universal mother rhythm. Eden watched the motion, like it was a sacred ritual he was being allowed to witness from behind a glass wall. "You are so good at this," he whispered. "I've had practice," I replied, my voice softening despite myself. "She's bonded to me." That's how attachment works, Eden. It's not about blood. It's about consistency, presence, being the one who's there at 3 a.m. when the fever breaks. "You're a professor," he said with a faint, sad smile. "Of course you'd explain it like a peer-reviewed study." I shot him a look. "This isn't theoretical for me. This is her nervous system. This is her sense of safety, in a world that already wants too much from her." He nodded slowly, leaning a hand against the wall to steady himself. He looked smaller than he had in the lecture hall. The weight of fatherhood was a heavy thing to drop on a man's shoulders in the middle of a Tuesday night. "Can I?" He hesitated, his eyes fixed on Emma's small, waving hand. "Can I hold her? Just for a second?" Every instinct in my body screamed no. If I let him hold her, the secret wasn't just a fact. It became a physical reality. It became a bond I couldn't undo. I thought of the Cole lawyers. I thought of my own upbringing, the trailer parks, the white trash labels, my mother's periodic disappearances into a haze of pills. I was a PhD now, but in the eyes of a family like his, I was still the girl from the wrong side of the tracks who had trapped their golden boy. But then I saw the way he was looking at her. It wasn't the look of a man thinking about a legal battle. It was the look of a man who had just found a piece of his own soul. 1 minute, I said, my heart hammering against my ribs. And you sit down. You don't move. He obeyed instantly, perching on the edge of the velvet armchair where I spent my nights nursing. He sat like he'd been given a glass sculpture to hold. I leaned over and transferred Emma carefully. I watched his hands, large, tanned and calloused from rowing, yet surprisingly gentle as they cradled her head. Emma blinked up at him. She seemed to recognize the scent, or perhaps the vibration of his voice. She let out a soft coo and relaxed against his chest, her tiny head fitting perfectly into the crook of his arm. Eden made a sound I'd never heard from him before. It was a jagged, wet sound, something between a laugh and a sob. "Oh," he breathed, his voice cracking. "Oh my God. She's real." Emma reached out and grasped his pinky finger. Her grip was ironclad, the primitive reflex of a baby holding on for dear life. Eden froze. He didn't even breathe. "She's so strong," he whispered. "She's a survivor," I said, standing over them, ready to snatch her back at the first sign of trouble. "She had to be." He began to rock her slightly, a clumsy, nervous motion, but he was trying. He looked down at her, and I saw the first tear fall. It landed on Emma's sleeve, a dark circle on the white cotton. Then another. He didn't try to hide them. He just stared at her, his face a map of pure, unadulterated grief and joy. "I should have been here," he said hoarsely. "For the ultrasound. For the birth. I should have been the one driving you to the hospital." I didn't answer. If I admitted that I'd wanted him there, that I'd spent my labor staring at the hospital ceiling, imagining a man with blue eyes holding my hand, I would break. And I couldn't afford to break. After a few minutes, the reality of the situation began to settle back over me like a cold shroud. I reached down. "That's enough. Give her to me." He handed her back with agonizing slowness, his fingers lingering on her back for a second too long. When he stood up, he seemed to tower over me again, the intensity of the moment shifting back into a confrontation. "She's mine, Eden," I said, my voice trembling with a sudden, sharp fear. "I know who your family is. I know the power you have. But if you try to take her, if you try to use my past against me, I will fight you with everything I have. I'm not that scared little girl from the trailer park anymore." He looked at me, genuinely confused. "What are you talking about?" "Your past? My mother. My record from when I was 17. The white trash upbringing your parents would love to cite in a custody hearing," I spat out, the words tasting like poison. "I know how the Coles work. You win, always." Eden's expression hardened, but not with the arrogance I expected. It was a look of profound insult. "You think I'm my father? You think I'd use a child as a weapon in a legal game?" "Cassie, look at me." I didn't want to look at him. "I won't tell anyone," he said, his voice a low, steady vow. "Not my parents. Not London. Not a soul. This stays between us, until you are ready. I don't care about your past. I care about the woman who raised this beautiful girl by herself, while I was busy worrying about my GPA." "That's not enough," I said, clutching Emma tighter. "A promise isn't a contract." "I know," he replied. "But it's where we start. I'm a finance major, Cassie. I know a high-value asset when I see one. And you and Emma, you're the only things in this world that matter to me right now." I walked him to the door in a daze. The hallway felt longer than it had 10 minutes ago. My apartment, which had been a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. At the threshold, he stopped. He turned back, his blue eyes burning with a fire that made my pulse spike. The flirty auditor was gone. The boy was gone. In his place was a man who had found his North Star. "I'm not done," he said, his voice a quiet promise. "Not with you. Not with her. I'll go at your pace. I'll follow your rules for now. But don't think for a second that I'm walking away from my daughter." I crossed my arms, my professional armor snapping back into place even though it felt paper thin. "This doesn't change the rules, Eden. You are a student. I am a professor. We have a life here that cannot be disrupted." He smiled faintly, a real smile this time, one that reached his eyes. "It changes everything, Dr. Hale. You're the one who taught us that a single variable can shift an entire data set. Well, consider the variable introduced." When the door finally closed, I locked it. I turned the deadbolt, then the chain. I leaned my back against the wood and slid down until I was sitting on the floor, Emma warm and heavy in my arms. My heart was racing, a frantic staccato in the silence of the foyer. The life I had so carefully engineered, the spreadsheets, the schedules, the safe, predictable vacuum of single motherhood, was unraveling at the seams. I looked down at Emma. She was drifting back to sleep, her tiny face peaceful, her hand still curled as if she were holding onto his finger. The equation had changed. The outliers had moved to the center. And for the first time in my life, I realized that some problems couldn't be solved with logic. I was no longer alone, and that was the most terrifying thought of all. Chapter 4. Quiet Variables. The first rule we never discussed, but both instinctively followed, was silence. No texts that lingered too long. No appearances together on campus. No conversations that crossed the line into something that could be quoted, screenshot, or misinterpreted. We were two celestial bodies caught in a shared gravity, rotating around a tiny 6-pound sun named Emma. Eden didn't come back the next night. Or the one after that. Instead, he began to orbit. He showed up in the margins of my life in ways that were almost respectful. Strategic. As if he understood that the fastest way to lose my trust was to demand it. He traded his arrogance for observation. He traded his designer button-downs for dark, expensive knit sweaters and soft cotton shirts that he didn't mind getting wrinkled by a baby's grasp. On Monday, there was a bag of diapers outside my door. I was surprised to find they were the right size 1, transitioning to 2. He'd done his research, though the Healthy Baby brand was ridiculously expensive, the kind of organic bamboo fiber luxury that cost more for a pack than I spent on groceries in a week. It was his way of providing without intruding, a quiet flexing of his resources. On Wednesday, my campus card was remotely topped up. I didn't have to check the balance to know it was him. The sudden abundance of meal points felt like a heavy weight in my pocket. On Friday, he sat 3 tables away in the library, not approaching, just there, a silent sentry in a navy wool coat. He didn't look at me, but I could feel the heat of his attention every time I turned a page. "One coffee does not buy absolution," I told him when I finally approached his table, my voice a low hiss that barely carried over the hum of the library. He looked up from a thick macroeconomics textbook, those blue eyes. Emma's eyes, cutting through me. They were clearer than they had been weeks ago, less clouded by the panic of the initial discovery. "I wouldn't dare assume that, Cassidy. It buys neutrality, for now." The fracture, neutrality, however, is a fragile state. It shattered the night Emma's fever spiked 2 weeks later. I was a mess of frayed nerves and sleep deprivation. I didn't have anyone to lean on. My parents were states away and largely uninvolved. My friends were busy being 20-somethings who thought responsibility meant making it to an 8 a.m. lab. So I called him. When Eden arrived, he didn't perform. He didn't play the billionaire hero, coming to save the day with a private doctor. He simply stepped into the apartment, shed his jacket, and washed his hands with the surgical precision of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. "Thermometer says 101, I whispered, my voice cracking as I bounced a whimpering Emma against my shoulder. "We follow the chart," he said, his voice a low, grounding anchor. He sat on the floor, leaning against the crib, and began reading the pediatrician's notes I'd taped to the wall. He didn't ask permission. He just reached out, and for the first time, I let him take her. He held her for 3 hours, pacing the small living room while I collapsed on the sofa. I was exhausted, watching the way his large, capable hands cradled her tiny, heated head. He looked like a man who had suddenly found his center of gravity. By 3 a.m. the fever broke. By 4 a.m. the exhaustion turned into something else. Eden was sitting on the edge of the couch, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his hair disheveled. The air in the apartment felt thick, charged with the relief of the crisis passing, and the sudden, sharp awareness of how close we were. "You should sleep," I murmured, leaning back against the cushions. "I'm fine," he said, but he didn't move. He looked at me, his gaze dropping to my mouth and then back to my eyes. I didn't think I could feel this way. Like the world starts and ends in this tiny, drafty apartment. It's a terrifying feeling, isn't it? I gave him a slow, weary smile. "Terrifying," he agreed. He reached out, his thumb brushing the line of my jaw. The contact felt like a live wire, sending a jolt through my system that woke up every nerve ending I'd tried to numb. "I spent my whole life being taught how to take things, Cassidy. No one ever taught me how to want to give everything away." The air between us vanished. I leaned forward, meeting him halfway. When his lips touched mine, it wasn't the jagged, desperate heat of the night Emma was conceived. It was slow, heavy, and thick with a year's worth of unspoken questions. He moved with a sudden, controlled urgency, pulling me into his lap. My hands found the hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him closer, kneading the friction. He tasted like coffee and the cold night air, a sharp contrast to the stifling warmth of the room. "Eden," I breathed against his neck. "I've got you," he muttered, his hands sliding under my oversized sweater, finding the bare skin of my waist. His palms were hot, slightly calloused from rowing, and utterly unyielding. He lifted me, carrying me toward the small bedroom, mindful of the sleeping infant in the next room. He laid me back against the pillows, the dim light from the street lamp filtering through the blinds and casting slats of shadow across his face. He looked like a statue come to life, intense, focused, and utterly devoted to the task of unraveling me. He stripped off his shirt, his chest broad and pale in the moonlight. When he joined me on the bed, the weight of him was a comfort I hadn't realized I was starving for. He kissed his way down my throat, his stubble grazing my skin, sending shivers through my nerves that felt like sparks. "Is this okay?" he whispered against my collarbone, his voice vibrating in his chest. "Yes," I choked out, arching into him. "God, yes." There was no elegance in the way we shed our clothes, only a frantic need to bridge the gap, a desperation and longing born of months of forced distance. When he finally moved over me, his eyes were dark, almost black in the shadows. He moved slowly at first, testing the limits of my breath, his movements rhythmic and deliberate. Every thrust felt like a claim, not of ownership, but of belonging. I wrapped my legs around his waist, pulling him deeper, my fingers digging into the muscles of his shoulders. The friction was a slow burn that built into an inferno, a physical manifestation of all the months we'd spent pretending we didn't matter to one another. He buried his face in the crook of my neck, his breath coming in ragged hitches as we reached the peak together. It wasn't just sex, it was a collision of two people who had no business being together, yet couldn't find a way to stay apart. Afterward, we lay in the tangled sheets, the silence of the apartment returning. He didn't pull away. He held me, his chin resting on the top of my head, his heart beating a steady, frantic rhythm against mine. "We can't just be variables anymore, Cassidy," he said softly. "I know." The domestic rhythm, the month that followed, was a fever dream of domesticity. It was a secret world we built within the four walls of my apartment. Eden started staying over 3-4 nights a week. He brought a go bag that he hid in the back of my closet, full of soft t-shirts and joggers that made him look less like a coal heir and more like a father. There were moments of bliss I hadn't dared to imagine. I remember waking up at 6 a.m. to the sound of low humming. I crept into the small kitchen to find Eden, shirtless and sleep-muddled, swaying back and forth with Emma in his arms, while he waited for a bottle to warm in a bowl of hot water. He was humming a melody that sounded suspiciously like a Chopin nocturne. "You're a natural," I whispered, leaning against the doorframe. He looked over, a sheepish grin breaking through his usual stoicism. "It's just physics, Cass. Keep the center of gravity stable, provide a consistent vibration, and she stays quiet." "Is that what you call it? Physics?" "In my head, everything is an equation," he admitted, looking down at the baby who was currently chewing on his thumb. "But she's the first variable I can't seem to solve. She just is." We spent Sunday afternoons on the floor, a patchwork quilt spread over the rug. Eden would lie on his stomach, eye to eye with Emma, showing her black and white high-contrast cards. He would explain the principles of supply and demand to a 4-month-old, as if she were a Harvard board member, and she would respond by blowing bubbles and grabbing his nose. "She needs to be prepared," he'd say defensively when I laughed. "The world isn't kind to people who don't understand the market. She needs to learn how to roll over first, Eden." Those were the golden hours, the hours where I forgot that outside this door, he was a prince of industry, and I was a girl with a ruined reputation. In here, we were just two people trying to figure out how to be a we. He learned the mundane details of my life. He knew I liked my toast burnt. He knew I cried at laundry detergent commercials when I was tired. He knew that the faucet in the bathroom leaked if you didn't turn it just right. And he spent 3 hours on a Saturday fixing it with a YouTube tutorial and a wrench he'd bought at the hardware store around the corner. "You could have just hired a plumber," I'd said, watching him struggle with a U-joint. "I wanted to do it," he grunted, grease smeared across his forehead. "I want to be the one who fixes things for you." The carnival, the domestic bliss, was a lie we told ourselves, until one Saturday at the local carnival. It was a sea of primary colors, the smell of fried dough, and the mechanical whir of the Ferris wheel. Emma was strapped to Eden's chest in a carrier, her blue eyes wide as she took in the flashing lights. At 5 months old, this was the first time she had truly ever been out in a large, loud crowd. Eden looked absurd. A man who owned various pairs of $500 shoes, now meticulously checking the safety straps on a baby carrier. He wore a dark baseball cap pulled low, trying to blend in, but there was no hiding the way he carried himself. "She likes the lights," he noted, sounding genuinely impressed by her curiosity. "She likes the noise," I corrected, smiling as I wiped a stray bit of drool from Emma's chin. For a few minutes we were just a family, not a scholarship student and a billionaire's heir, not a secret buried under layers of NDAs and social expectations. Just 3 people in the sun. Then, the world tilted. "Eden?" The voice was high, cultured, and dripping with a confusion that bordered on accusation. We both froze. Standing 10 feet away, clutching a stick of pink cotton candy that looked like a neon cloud, was London. She was dressed in head-to-toe white linen, looking like she'd stepped off a yacht in the Hamptons and onto the wrong planet. Her blonde hair was perfectly coiffed, her makeup flawless, and her expression horrified. Her eyes went from Eden's face to the baby strapped to his chest, then finally to me. The color drained from her cheeks, replaced by a sharp, calculating glint that made my stomach drop. "London," Eden said. His voice dropped an octave, instantly becoming the cold, formidable man I'd first met at that faculty party. The dad, who had been cooing at Emma seconds ago, vanished behind a mask of granite. What is this?" she asked, her gaze fixed on Emma. She stepped closer, squinting, her eyes scanning the baby's features with predatory precision. "She has your eyes. Eden, she has your exact eyes." "Is she yours?" The silence that followed was deafening. The carnival music seemed to distort, the laughter of children turning into a dull, underwater roar in my ears. I felt the eyes of the crowd on us, though no one else cared. The secret was out. The variable had been exposed. Eden stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of me, a protective instinct he didn't even seem to realize he had. He moved with the territorial grace of a predator, guarding its young. "Not here, London, not now. You've been missing for weeks. You skipped the Founders Gala. Your father thinks you're in a depressive slump, hiding out in some penthouse," London whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of horror and a sickening kind of excitement. "But you're here, playing house. In a parking lot. With her." The way she said her felt like a slap. "Go home, London," Eden said, his tone dangerously low, the kind of voice that made people in boardrooms stop breathing. "We will talk, but you will keep your mouth shut until I call you. Do you understand me? If a single word of this leaves your lips before I'm ready, I will ensure your family's firm is gutted by Monday morning." London looked at me, a sneer curling her lip, but there was genuine fear in her eyes. She knew the power the Coles held, but she also knew she now held the greatest weapon in their family history. She looked at Emma one last time, a look of pure loathing, before turning on her heel and vanishing into the crowd without another word. Eden turned back to me. His face was a mask of stone, but his hands, the ones holding Emma's carrier, were shaking. The sun was still shining, the popcorn was still smelling sweet, but the world had ended. "It's over, isn't it?" I asked, the cold air of reality finally biting through my skin. The silence, the orbit. "It's all gone." Eden looked down at Emma, who was reaching for a stray red balloon floating by, totally oblivious to the fact that her existence had just become a declaration of war. "No," Eden said, his eyes meeting mine with a terrifying, burning intensity. "It's just beginning, and this time, I'm not letting anyone take the variables away. I'm changing the equation." He reached out, grabbing my hand, his grip tight and desperate. "We're going home. We need to pack." "Pack?" "Eden, what?" "London won't stay quiet for long," he said, pulling me toward the exit. "And when my father finds out, this apartment won't be a sanctuary anymore. It'll be a cage. I'm moving you to the estate." "The estate?" "Eden, I can't." "You can," he snapped, then softened, his thumb rubbing circles into my palm. "You have to. I won't lose her. And I won't lose you." As we walked away from the lights and the noise, I looked back at the carnival. It looked so small now. So fragile. Just like the life we'd been trying to build. The quiet variables were gone, replaced by a loud, screaming reality that was about to tear our worlds apart. The first thing Eden did when we got back to the apartment was lock the door. Not gently. Not absent-mindedly. He turned the deadbolt with a sharp, decisive twist, the metallic clack echoing like a gunshot in the cramped hallway. He was sealing us inside a bunker, or perhaps a cage. The carnival noise still rang in my ears. The distorted calliope music, the smell of grease and sugar, the distant, joyous shriek of a ride. But in here, the silence pressed down hard and fast, a suffocating velvet. Emma had fallen asleep in the carrier, her tiny chest rising and falling against the rhythmic thumping of Eden's heart. He didn't take her off immediately. He just stood there in the middle of the living room, one hand braced on the back of a chair, head bowed. His breathing was heavy, ragged, like he'd just run a marathon instead of walking 3 blocks. "You threatened her," I said quietly, my voice sounding thin in the stillness. He looked up. His blue eyes weren't shattering anymore. They were frozen. "I warned her. You told her you'd destroy her family, Eden. That's not a warning. That's a declaration of war. She already knows I can." His jaw tightened, the muscle leaping under his skin. "That wasn't the threat, Cassidy. The threat was that I'd do it without hesitation. No board meetings, no second chances. Just glass and ash." I swallowed hard, a cold shiver racing down my spine. This was the Eden I'd only glimpsed in the sharp margins of his personality, the one who had been raised in marble boardrooms instead of playgrounds. This was the man who understood leverage the way other people understood kindness, who saw the world as a series of hostile takeovers and net gains. You shouldn't have had to do that, I said, moving closer, though a part of me wanted to run. No, he agreed, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous vibration. I shouldn't have had to hide my daughter either. The word daughter landed between us like a dropped glass, sharp and impossible to ignore. Emma, his daughter. The truth still felt unreal when spoken aloud, like saying it too clearly might shatter the fragile, beautiful bubble we'd lived in for the last month. Eden finally unbuckled the carrier with trembling fingers. He laid Emma down in her crib, smoothing a hand over her dark blonde hair with a tenderness that still startled me. It was a jarring contrast. The man who could gut a multi-million-dollar firm, and the man who knew exactly how to tuck a blanket around a 5-month-old's toes. Then he turned back to me, rolling his sleeves up, exposing the corded muscle of his forearms. It was a signal. The domestic bliss was over. The strategist was back. Okay, he said, his eyes scanning the room as if calculating the exit points. We need to talk logistics. I let out a short, humorless laugh. Logistics? You just threatened a socialite at a carnival, Eden. I think logistics left the building the moment London saw your eyes on our baby. He crossed the room in 3 strides, stopping so close I could feel the heat radiating off him. He smelled like the outdoors and the faint, expensive, clean scent of his soap, sandalwood, cinnamon, and mint. Cassidy, he said, his voice a low, grounding anchor. London won't stay quiet. She's a creature of gossip. It's her only currency. And even if I scare her into a week of silence, my parents are not idiots. They've noticed my distraction. They've noticed the dip in my social appearances. If they pull on the wrong thread, they'll find this apartment. They'll find you. And they'll find Emma. My chest tightened until it hurt to breathe. So what's the plan? Lock us in a tower? Hire men with earpieces? Make this go away with a check? His eyes flashed with a sudden, sharp hurt. No, I was going to ask you to trust me. I stepped back, hitting the edge of the kitchen table. Trust you? Eden, your world is a shark tank. I'm just a woman with a baby. If I step into your world, I don't just get wet. I get eaten. I know, he cut in, dragging a hand through his hair, looking genuinely unraveled. I know what this looks like. I know my family is violent in its own way. It is a well-known fact that he is ruthless. But I swear to you, Cass, I will not let them touch you. I will build a wall around this family that even my father can't climb. I believed him. That was the most terrifying part. Days passed and London kept her promise. For exactly 3 weeks. 3 weeks of a silence that felt too loud, like the indrawn breath before a scream. Eden was forced back into his real life. He traveled constantly. Zurich, Geneva, Milan, stacking meetings back to back as he prepared for a summer placement at one of his father's European holdings. It was a test. His father was watching. He FaceTimed every night. I'd see him in sleek, cold hotel rooms or the beige leather interior of a private jet. He'd loosen his tie, the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes, but he'd always soften when Emma squealed at the screen. She likes your voice, I told him one night, watching her kick her legs wildly at the glowing image of his face. She likes the frequency, he replied, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. I'm just a variable. You're the constant, Cassidy. Don't forget that. But the distance changed things. Every time he hung up, the apartment felt smaller, the shadows longer. The secrecy was no longer a cozy blanket. It was a shroud. And then, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, the shroud was ripped away. There was a knock at my door, not the frantic, rhythmic knock Eden used, not the polite tap of Mrs. Gable. This was formal, measured, authoritarian. I looked through the peephole and felt my blood turn to ice. A man in a charcoal gray suit stood in the hallway, flanked by a woman in pearls and a man whose posture screamed generational wealth and total entitlement, his dark olive skin and blue eyes instantly recognizable. The woman's hair was silver and immaculate, her face a triumph of expensive dermatology. The man, Eden's father, Silas Cole, had eyes like frozen flint. Behind them stood a younger man holding a leather briefcase, the lawyer. He looked like a lawyer. Emma was sound asleep in her bassinet. I didn't need an introduction. I opened the door because I knew if I didn't, they would simply buy the building and kick the door down. Dr. Cassidy Hale, the woman said, her voice smooth as silk and just as cold. How quaint. I'm busy, I replied, my hand gripping the doorframe so hard my knuckles turned white. And you are trespassing, Silas Cole smiled, a thin, predatory curve of his lips. We assure you, Dr. Hale, we are quite accustomed to being let in. The lawyer cleared his throat, sensing the atmospheric pressure rising. May we come inside? This conversation would be more productive if held privately. Behind me, Emma stirred in her sleep, letting out a soft, tiny whimper. The woman's gaze flicked past my shoulder, landing unerringly on the crib in the corner. Her expression didn't soften. If anything, it sharpened. "You have 5 minutes," I said, stepping aside. "And then I call the police." They entered like they owned the oxygen in the room. They didn't look at the furniture or the small apartment that I tried to keep clean. They looked through it, as if it were a minor inconvenience of the physical plane. "You've caused quite a disruption," Eden's mother, Eleanor said, settling onto my sofa as if it were a throne. "My son is distracted. Off course. His metrics are failing for the first time in his life." "I didn't invite him here," I said, standing tall. "He chose to come. He chose to stay." "Oh, we know. No one makes Eden do anything," Silas replied, his voice a low rumble. "But experienced women like yourself always say that. The choice of a young man with more adrenaline and hormones than sense." The lawyer opened his briefcase with a crisp click. "Let's be clear," Eleanor continued, her eyes locking onto mine. "We know about the child. We know about the little affair you have going on. And we know everything about your lackluster background, the druggy parents, the mountain of student debt." My spine went rigid. "Then you also know she's his. You see his face when you look at her. That's undeniable, yes. She has those coal blue eyes," she said dismissively, waving a manicured hand. "Eden is a coal. He is a legacy. He is currently engaged to London Avery, a union that has been solidified since he was 16. This arrangement of yours is an inconvenient footnote. Emma is an unforeseen circumstance." "Engaged?" I repeated, flinching at the description of Emma. The word felt like a physical blow to the stomach. Eden hadn't told me. He'd talked about expectations, but he hadn't used that word. "He will marry her upon graduation," Silas said. "As planned. As is necessary for the merger of our firms." "And Emma?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What is she in your merger?" Eleanor smiled, and it was the most horrific thing I'd ever seen. "An unfortunate complication, one that can be handled with discretion." Something inside me snapped. The fear evaporated, replaced by a white-hot, protective rage. "You don't get to erase my daughter," I said, my voice vibrating with power I didn't know I had. "Get out. Now." The lawyer hesitated. "Ms. Hale, please?" "No," I snapped. "You don't get to threaten me in the place where I raise my child and expect me to play the victim." Silas Cole sighed, looking bored. "We weren't threatening her, for goodness sake. She is our granddaughter. Name a number." I froze. "A number," he repeated, leaning forward. "You want security? You want to never worry about a light bill again? You want your child to have a trust fund that ensures she never has to work a day in her life? Name the price for your silence and your departure." My mind raced. I looked at my comfortable but tiny apartment. I hardly had any savings, and a lot of my earnings went toward my student debts. Then I looked at Emma. If I took their money, she'd be a princess. If I stayed, she'd be a target. She wouldn't have to ever worry about having a meal, or having the lights switched off. She would never have to worry about that. 60 million, I said. The lawyer let out a startled cough. Eleanor actually laughed. "You think that's high?" I asked, leaning over the coffee table, my eyes boring into hers. "How much is Eden worth?" 800 million, according to Google. If I stay with Eden, I get more than money. I get the coal name. I get the influence. I get the protection of the man who is currently obsessed with me. You want me gone? You pay the premium for the life I'm giving up. Silence descended. It was a heavy, suffocating thing. Eleanor studied me differently now. The disdain was still there, but it was joined by something close to respect. She recognized a shark when she saw one. I needed to be one for Emma's security and future. "Fine," Silas said, his voice clipped. "The funds will be transferred to a blind trust within 48 hours. You leave tonight." "I leave," I replied, my heart breaking even as I spoke the words. "And I disappear. For 4 years, no contact, no appearances when the money hits my account." "And then?" Eleanor asked. "And then, when he's finished his obligations and his marriage is a settled fact, I come back. I won't deprive him of his child forever." 4 years of silence. "Then he gets to choose." They exchanged a look. For them, 4 years was enough time to break any man's spirit, to bury any memory of a college romance. "Agreed," Silas said. I closed my eyes, listening to the sound of them leaving. I loved Eden. I loved the way he hummed to Emma. I loved the way he looked in a wrinkled sweater. The way he held me every morning in his hard, secure arms. The way he smelled. And that was exactly why I did it. I knew his family. I knew they would never stop until they broke us. By taking the money, I wasn't just surviving. I was giving Eden the chance to become the man he needed to be before he could truly protect us. I packed that night. I didn't cry until I was taping the box shut. I left a single letter on the kitchen table, no explanations, just a goodbye that felt like a suicide note. I took Emma and vanished into the rain before the first million even hit the account, because loving Eden Cole meant knowing I would never belong in his world, and because sometimes the only way to save the person you love is to become the villain in their story. The breakthrough happened in a windowless boardroom in Zurich that smelled of burnt espresso, ozone, and the kind of high-altitude ambition that makes the lungs ache. I knew it was a breakthrough because the man across from me, Marcus Vance, a man who possessed the surgical calm of a Swiss watch and the predatory eyes of a hawk, finally stopped tapping his Mont Blanc pen against the mahogany table. He leaned back, his tailored suit jacket shifting with a whisper of silk. He exhaled a long, measured breath and smiled. It was a thin, expensive smile that looked like it cost him a great deal of effort. "You've solved the volatility problem, Mr. Cole," he said, his voice a low gravel. "You haven't eliminated it. Only a fool claims to do that. But you have contained it. You've turned the storm into a battery." I didn't smile back. I had spent the last 3 years learning that men of Vance's stature mistrusted enthusiasm. To them, passion was a variable that clouded judgment. They respected restraint. They wanted to believe they had discovered a rare element, not that they were being sold a product. "Risk isn't the enemy," I said, my voice echoing off the soundproofed walls. "Uncertainty is. Our model doesn't pretend the markets are moral or predictable. It simply reads the terror of the herd more accurately than the herd reads itself." Vance studied me for an agonizingly long moment. I could feel the sweat itching at the small of my back, hidden beneath a shirt that cost more than my first car. Then, he closed the leather-bound folder. "We will proceed. Seed funding tonight. Series A within 12 months. Assuming your performance aligns with these projections. Welcome to the inner circle, Eden." It took everything in me not to let out the breath I'd been holding since I boarded the plane in New York. Instead, I stood and extended my hand. My grip was firm, my expression a mask of cold granite, the very thing my father had spent 22 years carving into my soul. "You won't regret it," I said. "I never do," he replied. The meeting dissolved into the polite chaos of high finance. Hands were shaken. Business cards thick as cardstock were exchanged. Assistants appeared like ghosts to whisk away tablets and coffee cups. Someone clapped me on the shoulder and said something congratulatory in German that I only half heard. My mind was already 3,000 miles away. I was thinking about a cramped apartment in a neighborhood my parents wouldn't drive through with the windows down. I was thinking about the way the light caught the red gold in Cassidy's hair when she stood at the stove. I was thinking about the weight of Emma in my arms, the only thing in my life that didn't feel like a transaction. I stepped out of the glass and steel monolith, into the sharp, biting alpine air of Zurich. The sky was a bruised purple, and the lights of the city were beginning to twinkle like fallen diamonds. My phone was already in my hand. There is a particular, soaring kind of happiness that settles in your chest when the future stops feeling like a ghost story and starts feeling like an inheritance. I wanted to hear her voice. I wanted to tell her we were safe. That I had built the wall. That I had become the shark, so no one could ever bite us. I walked toward the Limmat River, waiting until I hit a stretch with a full signal. My thumb hovered over her name, Cass. I dialed. It rang once. A hollow, electronic chirp. Then again, the number you have dialed is not available. Please check the number and try again. I frowned, the cold air suddenly feeling much sharper against my skin. I checked the screen. It was her number. I tried again, thinking it was a glitch in the roaming service. Same result. The same flat, mechanical woman's voice telling me the connection was dead. A faint, unfamiliar unease curled in the pit of my stomach, like a drop of ink in clear water. I opened our messages. "Me. Just wrapped the meeting. We got it, Cass. All of it. Call me the second you see this. I love you." The word delivered appeared in small gray text. I stared at it until the screen timed out. I kept walking, my pace quickening. I told myself she was busy. She was working. She was bathing Emma. Emma had dropped the phone in the toilet. There were 1,000 mundane reasons for silence. By the time I reached my hotel, the unease had grown teeth. I sat on the edge of the king-sized bed, the luxury of the room feeling suddenly oppressive. I called her every 10 minutes for an hour. Then I called the landline. Disconnected. I called her office at the university. "Dr. Cassidy Hale?" the receptionist asked, sounding distracted. "She resigned 4 days ago, honey. Effective immediately. No forwarding info." The phone slipped an inch in my grip. Resigned? Why? Didn't say. Just packed her locker and left. "Are you a student?" All her classes have been taken up by Leonard Brooks. All his details have been sent to your email. I hung up without answering. The ink in my stomach had turned into a black hole, swallowing the triumph of the afternoon. The flight back to the States was 14 hours of static and shadows. I sat in the first-class cabin, surrounded by men in suits, sleeping under cashmere blankets, but I felt like I was vibrating out of my skin. Every time the plane hit turbulence, I felt a jolt of pure, unadulterated terror. Cassidy never called back. My messages sat unread, no longer even delivered, just sent. Somewhere over the dark expanse of the Atlantic, the fear sharpened into a cold, hard realization. I knew my family. I knew the way they moved, not with blunt force, but with the quiet precision of a garrote. I landed at JFK just after noon. I didn't go to my apartment. I didn't check in with my office. I took a car straight to the boroughs, watching the skyline blur through the rain-streaked window. The building looked the same red brick facade, the same old paint on the fire escape, the same faint smell of laundry detergent and old radiators that always greeted me like a hug. I took the steps 3 at a time, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I reached her door, 4B. I knocked. A quick, rhythmic rap. Our knock. Nothing. I knocked again, harder, the wood rattling in the frame. Cass? Cass, it's me. Open up. Silence. I hammered on the door now, my voice rising, stripped of all its Zurich polish. Cassidy! Emma! A door opened across the hall. Mrs. Gable, the elderly woman who lived in 4C and usually complained about the youth in the building, peered out. I tried my key, but it didn't work. The locks had been changed. You looking for Cassidy? She asked, her voice cracking. Relief hit me so hard I almost swayed. Yes, Mrs. Gable. Is she inside? I can't get her on the phone. The woman shook her head, a slow, pitying movement. She moved out, son. Couple days ago, middle of the night almost. The hallway tilted. The world seemed to lose its color, fading into a dull, sickening gray. Moved? What do you mean, moved? Where? Didn't say. A big black car came. 2 men in suits helped her with the boxes. She looked like she'd seen a ghost. Quiet. Real quiet. Even the baby didn't make a peep. I turned slowly back to the door. I hadn't noticed it in my panic, but there was a small, typed sign taped to the wood, right above the eye-level peephole. For rent. Available immediately. Contact building, MGMT. I stared at that sign for a long time. It was so final. So clinical. I reached out and touched the wood, my fingers trembling. The apartment was empty. The life we had spent months building, the mismatched furniture, the smell of baby powder and early morning coffee, the whispered promises in the dark, it had been erased. I don't remember sitting down, but suddenly I was on the top step, my head in my hands. The hollow in my chest was so vast it felt like I was breathing through a wound. She wouldn't just leave, not Cassidy. She was the most stubborn, loyal, fierce person I had ever known. She had looked me in the eye and told me she'd wait for me to build the wall, unless the wall had been built around her instead. I stood up. The grief didn't vanish, but it was suddenly sheathed in a layer of white-hot, cold-blooded rage. I knew who lived in big black cars. I knew who sent men in suits to help people pack their lives into boxes. The house I grew up in, the Cole estate in Greenwich, was a monument to the idea that enough money can buy a version of reality where nothing ever goes wrong. It was a fortress of white stone, glass and steel, surrounded by acres of manicured lawn that looked like it had been trimmed with nail scissors. There were no toys on this lawn. No laughter echoed off these walls. It was a museum of power. I drove through the gates without stopping for the security guard, my tires screaming on the gravel. I didn't use my key. I slammed my fist against the heavy oak door. It opened before I could strike it a second time. My mother stood there. Eleanor Cole. She was wearing a cream silk blouse and pearls, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her expression as unreadable as a frozen lake. She looked at my disheveled suit, my wild eyes and my trembling hands with a touch of weary disappointment. "You're back from Zurich early," she said, her voice smooth as glass. "I trust the meeting went well? Your father mentioned Vance was impressed. Where is she?" I asked, my voice a low, dangerous vibration. She sighed, a tiny puff of air. "Still so dramatic, Eden. You really must learn to modulate your tone." "It's unrefined." I pushed past her, my boots echoing like thunder on the marble floor. "Where is she?" "In the study," she said, turning to follow me. "Waiting for you." We all were. My father was seated behind his desk, a massive slab of antique ebony that looked like it belonged in a cathedral. Silas Cole didn't look up when I entered. He was reviewing a document, a sleek silver pen in his hand. Standing in the corner was a man I recognized, Arthur Sterling, the family's head of legal. He held a tablet and a briefcase. "What did you do?" I demanded, slamming my palms down on the desk. My father finally looked up. His blue eyes, the same eyes I saw in the mirror every morning, the same eyes Emma had inherited, were like chips of flint. "We handled a problem, Eden," he said evenly. "A problem you were clearly too compromised to manage yourself." "She's gone," I choked out. "Her apartment is empty. Her life is gone." "What did you do to her?" "We didn't do anything to her, darling," my mother said, stepping into the room and closing the double doors with a soft final click. "We simply gave her an opportunity, and like any sensible woman with her background, she took it." "She wouldn't," I said. The words felt weak, even as they left my mouth. "She accepted our offer," my father said. "What offer?" The lawyer, Sterling, stepped forward. He didn't look me in the eye. "Ms. Hale entered into a legally binding agreement. She has agreed to remove herself and the child from your life for a period of no less than 4 years. In exchange, a substantial financial trust has been established in her name." The room seemed to shrink. The air became thick, like I was trying to breathe underwater. "You paid her," I whispered. "You bought her off." "We gave her security," Eleanor corrected. "The kind of security a girl like that can only dream of." "Do you have any idea what $60 million does for a woman who grew up wondering if the lights would stay on? Someone who grew up in a trailer park?" She didn't hesitate, Eden. Not for a second. She saw her chance and took it. "You're lying," I spat. "She loves me. She wouldn't trade Emma's father for a check." My father gestured to the lawyer. "Play the recording, Arthur. Let the boy hear the truth. It's better to cauterize the wound now." Sterling tapped the tablet. A voice filled the room. It was Cassidy, but it wasn't the Cassidy who whispered, "I love you," into my neck at 3 a.m. This voice was cold. It was professional. It was the voice of a woman who had spent years fighting for every scrap of respect she'd ever earned. 60 million, her voice said through the speakers. There was no tremor. No tears. And the funds must be in a blind trust. "I want it handled by a third-party firm, not yours. I leave tonight. I disappear for 4 years. No contact. No appearances. After that, once his obligations are met and his marriage is settled, then he can see his daughter." I heard my mother's voice on the tape, sounding almost impressed. "You're a shark, Dr. Hale." "I have to be," Cassidy replied. "To survive people like you." The recording ended. The silence that followed was deafening, a physical weight that pressed down on my shoulders until I thought my bones might snap. "She named the price," my father said, leaning back. "She negotiated like a pro. I actually find myself respecting her for it. She realized that being the secret mistress of a coal heir was a losing game. She took the exit ramp. I stared at the ebony desk until my vision blurred. I could see her in my mind, standing in that tiny kitchen, facing down these monsters. I could see the way her jaw would have tightened. "She didn't do this because she doesn't love me," I said, my voice barely a whisper. My father raised an eyebrow, a mocking glint in his eyes. "Oh? Then why did she do it, Eden? Why is she on a plane to nowhere right now with a bank account full of cold blood money?" I looked up at him. For the first time in my life, I didn't see a giant. I saw a small, fearful man who used gold to build a cage because he didn't know how to build a home. "She did it because she knew you'd never stop," I said. "She did it because she saw the world I come from, and she realized that if she stayed, you'd destroy her and Emma. You'd turn her into one of you. She didn't take the money to get rich, Dad. She took it to buy Emma's freedom from you." My mother's face contorted for a split second, a crack in the porcelain. "She took the money, Eden. That is the beginning and the end of the story." I looked at the lawyer, then back at my parents. I felt a strange, cold calm settle over me. The coal granite was back, but it wasn't theirs anymore. It was mine. "You think you won," I said softly. "You think you bought 4 years of silence so you can marry me off to London Avery and merge your firms? You think you've erased her." "We know we have," Silas said. "You have obligations, Eden." She was a distraction. I turned toward the door. "Eden?" my mother called out, her voice sharpening with a hint of genuine alarm. "Where are you going?" "There's a dinner tonight at the club. The Averys are expecting us." I stopped with my hand on the brass handle. I didn't look back. "I'm going to end it with London," I said. "And then I'm going to spend the next 4 years making sure that when Cassidy comes back, she doesn't find a coal heir waiting for her. She finds the man she thought I could be." "You'll lose everything," my father roared, his voice finally losing its composure. "The funding, the firm, the name." I opened the door. The hallway was bright, filled with the afternoon sun. "I already lost everything," I said. The only thing I have left is time. And 4 years is a very long time for a man who has nothing left to lose. I walked out of the house. I didn't search for her. Not because I didn't want to find her, but because I understood the contract. Cassidy had made a sacrifice. She had become the villain in my story so that Emma could have a hero. I got into my car and drove away from Greenwich, toward the city that felt like a graveyard. Every night for the next 4 years, I would look at the skyline and think of a woman who taught me that love isn't about possession. It isn't about holding on until your knuckles turn white. Sometimes, love is knowing when to let go, so that you can find each other again when the world is finally quiet enough to hear your name. I'll wait, Cassidy. I'll wait until the silence breaks. Chapter 7. The Shape of Waiting. Corsica had a way of slowing time, stretching it out until the seconds felt like something you could hold in your palm and examine. Cassidy learned this in increments, first in the silver-blue dawns that smelled of rosemary and salt, then in the heavy, honey-colored afternoons, and finally in the long evenings that lingered like a held breath. The island did not rush. The Mediterranean didn't hurry its waves. It let them lap against the jagged limestone cliffs with a rhythmic, hypnotic patience. The wind didn't apologize for its pauses, and the sun seemed to take its time sinking into the horizon, staining the sky peach, violet, and gold, as if it knew no one here would demand it move faster. She lay on a faded linen towel on a secluded stretch of beach just outside Calvi. One knee was bent, the other stretched toward the turquoise water. A paperback rested open against her thigh, its pages fluttering in the warm breeze. She hadn't turned a page in over 20 minutes. A few meters away, a shriek of pure crystalline laughter broke the stillness. "Attention, Emma! Pa comme ka asterisk," one of the local children called out, half scolding, half giggling. "I'm doing it!" Emma replied indignantly. Her accent, a charming collision of flat American vowels and soft melodic French consonants. "Regard. Look. Like this." Cassidy smiled, her eyes remaining closed for a moment longer. Emma was 2.5 now. She was all tan knees, wild dark blonde curls, and a relentless, exhausting curiosity. She spoke in a fluid, messy blend of English and French, switching languages mid-sentence with the careless confidence of a child who had never been told the world was supposed to make sense in only one way. She was building a fortress in the sand, an ambitious, crumbling structure assisted by 3 other children from the village. This life had not happened all at once. It had been assembled, brick by brick, breath by breath. 2 years ago, Cassidy had arrived in Corsica with one suitcase, one 7-month-old baby, and a bank account number that felt like a sin every time she thought of it. $60 million didn't land softly in the soul. It weighed. It pressed. It demanded a justification that she struggled to find in the quiet dark of her room. So she had built a life that justified the cost. She had paid off her student loans in a single, trembling transfer, watching the balance $0 screen until her vision blurred. She bought a modest stone house overlooking the sea, not a mansion, but a sanctuary with blue shutters that rattled in the mistral and a gnarled fig tree in the yard. She had learned the language, the customs, and herself. She had stepped out of the shadow of the Cole name and into the light of her own making, or so she told herself. The truth lived in the quieter places. It lived in the way her chest still tightened at the sight of a tailored white linen shirt, or the way she kept an old, dead phone tucked in the back of a velvet-lined drawer. Waiting. It was the shape her heart had taken. Cassidy shaded her eyes against the glare and looked up just in time to see Emma sprint toward her, barefoot and encrusted in sand, her curls bouncing like springs. "Maman," Emma announced, collapsing dramatically onto the towel, smelling of sun and sea salt. "Theo says the water is too cold for a castle moat, but I think he's just being a baby. He's probably just cautious," Cassidy said, brushing a stray curl from Emma's cheek. "Like his mother." Emma wrinkled her nose, her blue eyes, his eyes, sparkling with mischief. "I'm brave. I'm the bravest." "Yes," Cassidy agreed softly, her heart aching. "You are." She watched Emma run back toward the group, her tiny silhouette framed by the shimmering sea. She did not hear the footsteps behind her at first. The sand was too soft, the waves too rhythmic. Cassidy. The voice was real. It wasn't the haunting memory that played on a loop in her dreams. It wasn't a trick of the wind. It was a low, grounding anchor that dropped straight into the center of her soul. Her body reacted before her mind could process the impossibility of it. A sharp, jagged inhale. Her muscles locked into stone. The paperback slipped from her fingers, its pages drinking in the grit of the sand. She turned slowly, her heart hammering a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs. Eden stood 5 feet away. He looked different, yet achingly the same. He held his leather shoes in one hand, his dark jeans rolled at the ankles, a white linen shirt open at the collar and dampened by the humidity. He was leaner now, his face etched with the weight of 2 years of hard-won battles. There was a sharpness to his jaw, a weariness around his eyes that hadn't been there when he was a boy playing at being a shark. But his eyes, the coal blue that had once been frozen flint, were now burning with a raw, terrifying vulnerability. The world went silent. The children's laughter faded into the background. The sea held its breath. "You found me," she said, her voice sounding like it was being pulled through gravel. He nodded once, his gaze never leaving hers, as if he feared she might dissolve into sea foam if he looked away. "I did." "How?" "I spent every day of the last 2 years looking," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I spent every waking hour making sure I had the leverage to stop them from ever touching you again. I followed the money, Cass. You were careful, but I knew you'd want a house by the water. I just had to find the right stone cottage on the right island. I tried to disappear," she whispered. "I know," he said, taking a step closer. He didn't look triumphant. He looked like a man who had finally found the air he needed to breathe. "I know why you did it. I know what they told you." Emma's laughter rang out again, closer this time. Eden's gaze flicked instinctively toward the sound. He froze. Cassidy watched his face go through a lifetime of expressions in 3 seconds. Shock. Recognition. A devastating, beautiful grief. He looked at Emma, the height of her, the way she tossed her head, the way she held a plastic shovel like a scepter, and he crumbled. Not physically, but the mask he had spent a lifetime building simply disintegrated. "That's her," he choked out. "Yes, she's... God, Cassidy, she looks just like you." "But she has my... everything else," Cassidy finished for him. "She's happy, Eden. She's safe." He looked back at her, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "You did that. You took the villain's role to make sure she was happy. I took the money to buy her a life where no one could ever reach her," Cassidy said, her voice trembling. "I thought I was saving her from you, from all of you." "You saved us both," Eden said. He dropped his shoes in the sand and walked toward her until he was close enough that she could smell the sandalwood and mint on his skin. "I broke them, Cass. I took the company. I took the name. I built something that doesn't belong to Silas or Eleanor. There is no merger. There is no London. There is only what I've built for you, for us, Eden." "May I?" he asked, his voice breaking. "May I meet my daughter?" Cassidy looked at Emma, then back at the man who had waited 2 years to claim a life he hadn't even been sure still existed. The rage she had carried, the fear, the guilt, it all evaporated, leaving only a vast shimmering relief. "Yes," she said. They walked toward the shoreline together. Emma looked up as they approached, her curiosity flickering like a candle flame. She tilted her head, studying Eden with the frank, unblinking intensity of a child who knew she was the center of her own universe. Cassidy crouched beside her, placing a hand on Emma's shoulder. "Emma, mon cœur, there is someone very special I want you to meet." Emma's eyes widened as she looked at the tall man with the same eyes as her own. "Bonjour," she said solemnly. Eden dropped to both knees in the sand, ignoring the salt water soaking into his jeans. He looked at her as if she were the sun, and he had lived in a cave for a century. "Bonjour, Emma," he said. His voice was a wreck. Emma frowned slightly, stepping closer to inspect him. "You talk funny. Like the people on the television." Cassidy let out a wet, startled laugh. Eden smiled. A real, brilliant smile that reached his eyes for the first time in years. "I know. I'm practicing my French. It's very difficult." Emma considered this for a moment. Then, with the decisive grace of a queen, she held out a hand covered in wet sand and crushed seashells. "Do you want to see my castle? Theo says the tower is going to fall, but I think it just needs a bigger rock." Eden stared at her small hand. He reached out, his fingers trembling as he let her tiny palm rest against his. He closed his eyes for a second, a silent prayer of thanks. "I think a bigger rock is exactly what it needs," he said. "Show me." She dragged him toward the sand pile, chattering in her messy bilingual patter, explaining the structural integrity of the moat. Eden sat in the sand and listened, as if she were delivering the most important board report of his life. He didn't flinch when she smeared sand on his white shirt. He didn't look away when she climbed onto his lap to get a better angle on the turret. He belonged there. Later, as the sun dipped behind the horizon and the other children were called home by their mothers, Emma fell asleep in Eden's arms, exhausted by the labor of her construction. He carried her up the winding stone path to the cottage, his movements careful and reverent. They sat on the terrace afterward, the air cooling, the scent of the fig tree thick around them. "I meant what I said," Eden whispered, looking out at the dark expanse of the sea. "I'm not here to take her back to New York. I'm not here to force you into a world you hate." "Then why are you here?" Cassidy asked. "Because the 60 million wasn't a price for your absence," Eden said, turning to her. It was the down payment on the time I needed to become a man who could protect you. I'm not asking for a transaction, Cass. I'm asking for a chance to stay. Cassidy looked at her hands, then at the house she had built with the ghosts of her past. She looked at Eden, who had finally stopped being a Cole and started being himself. It's a long way from Zurich, she said softly. I'll walk it every day if I have to, he replied. He reached across the table, his hand open. Cassidy hesitated for a heartbeat, then slid her fingers into his. The connection was electric, a grounding wire that finally hummed with a steady, peaceful current. Waiting was over. The silence had broken, and in its place there was the sound of the sea, the rustle of the leaves, and the steady, quiet promise of a tomorrow that didn't have a price tag. Stay for dinner, she said, her voice finally certain. And then we'll see about tomorrow. Eden squeezed her hand, his eyes reflecting the first stars appearing in the Corsican sky. Tomorrow sounds like a very good start. Thank you so much for listening to the final chapter of this journey. If you enjoyed Eden and Cassidy's story, please make sure to hit that like button, leave a comment letting us know your favorite moment, and subscribe so you never miss a new story.